Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Seminary podcast about the nations. My name is Phil Hopkins. I'm the host. I'm professor of missions at Gateway Seminary. I've been here for a few years until recently, for about 20 years or so, I lived overseas. In this podcast, we address topics related to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel from here in California, across the U.S., and throughout the world. In these podcasts, these next couple podcasts are from the Evangelical Missiological Society. We had a meeting at Gateway Seminary on April 4th of 2025, the Southwest Regional Meeting, where we talked about topics related to ecclesiology and mission. And there were a number of people who presented, and in their presentations, we were able to record some of those. So we have a few of those here that have been recorded. Most of them are of pretty good quality. There are some that maybe are not so much, but we want to include those in this podcast segment. So there'll be a number of them that'll be spread out, talking from people from various backgrounds throughout the West Coast. Largely throughout the West Coast, from people from Fuller Seminary, from Cal Baptist, from Biola, from other different types of ministry organizations that are talking about ecclesiology and mission. So please enjoy. You'll see a number of different presentations that vary in length and that are quite unique to the people who, just as unique as the people who are presenting them. So we're thankful for those people. We're thankful that they have given us permission to record them, and we hope you all enjoy these podcasts, these presentations of these people. So enjoy, and please contact me with any questions if you have any. Thank you.
So the church as the body of Christ is called to bear witness in a world marked by religious plurality and cultural diversity. Nowhere is this imperative more pressing than in the context of Christian-Muslim relations. Historically, the Christian engagement with Muslims has been often shaped by apologetic polemics, theological confrontation, and colonial discourse. Yet, in recent decades, missiologists and theologians have increasingly recognized that authentic and effective witness among Muslims require a different posture, one rooted in humility, respect, and deep listening. So this realization was powerfully affirmed during the Fuller Theological Seminary's 2024 Intercultural Lectures, which I had the privilege of organizing under the theme Toward Respectful Understanding and Faithful Witness Among Muslims. The event was attended by more than 500 participants, featured presentations and panels from Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, and Europe. Across all sessions, one recurring emphasis stood out: the necessity of listening deeply to Muslims. This paper argues that deep listening is not merely a method of engagement, but an ecclesiological and missional imperative. Drawing on historical precedents, biblical theological foundations, and contemporary mission developments, I contend that deep listening enables Christians to build bridges of understanding, dismantle stereotypes, and witness to Muslims in ways that reflect the love and humility of Christ. So the first point is listening and mission among Muslims, historical and colonial models. So what are the models that we have in the history about deep listening? So the model that I want to bring out is actually from 7th, 8th centuries, the Arab Christian engagement with Muslims. The history of the Christian-Muslim engagement reveals that deep listening has long been practiced, particularly among the Arab Christians in the Middle East. Unlike later Western missionary encounters, these early engagements unfolded within a context where Christians lived as minorities under the Muslim political rule. As Zimmi means the protected minorities. That is actually the name that is given for all non-Muslims actually under the Muslim rule. Arab Christians shared language, culture, and social life with their Muslim neighbors, while also navigating asymmetrical power dynamics. So their proximity to Muslim communities combined with their minority status fostered a distinctive approach to engagement marked by respectful dialogue, theological reflection, and careful attentiveness to Muslim beliefs and their concerns. A prominent example is actually John of Damascus. He was born in 652 Common Era in Damascus during the early period of Islamic expansion. He served as the chief financial officer under the Umayyad Caliphate. It's almost like a finance minister, but he's serving under the Muslim ruler, a position inherited from his father. Given his family standing, it is likely that he received an education that included familiarity with the Quran, so he memorized the Quran just like any Muslim, Hadith literature, Arabic poetry, and a proficiency in Arabic. So Arabic Christians, such as the John of Damascus, engaged Islamic teachings not to dismiss them, but to understand and respond thoughtfully. While firmly defending Christian doctrines, especially the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus, they did so without disparaging Muslims. Their approach reflected careful listening, intellectual rigor, and a recognition of their Muslim neighbors' sincere faith. They engaged in conversation with the Muslim scholars, studied Islamic text, and offered thoughtful response to Muslim critics of Christianity. Their witness was rooted not in cultural dominance, but in attentiveness and mutual respect. So we know very little about actually how they actually defended Christianity or what was their conversation with the Muslims. But now there is much more actually interest in order to learn what are the other ways of actually engaging with Muslims. And this is one example of that one. So this historical model stands out in a sharp contrast to the colonial and confrontational approaches that later characterized much of the Western Christian mission among Muslims. Yeah. So I just want to explain a little bit about the colonial mission among Muslims. So we already may know, but I just want to actually bring it to your attention. So in contrast to the listening posture of Arab Christians, European engagement with the Muslims was shaped by violence, domination, and disregard. Their adversarial posture emerged from the legacy of crusades, which framed Christian-Muslim relations in terms of warfare and conquest. Marked by aggression and hostility, the crusades left no space for dialogue, respect, or deep listening. This pattern continued into the colonial era, when Muslim powers expanded their empires across Muslim world and brought nearly every Muslim majority country under the colonial rule. Colonialism was not merely a political project, but also a cultural and a religious one, underpinned by efforts to dominate and reshape Muslim societies. Central to this project was the colonial construction of Islam as a monolithic trans-historical tradition, unchanging, uniform, and inherently resistant to modernity. So this is the Islam that we actually teach in the seminaries, and this is what we actually learn. So this is a construction that came actually in the colonial period. So this essentialist view ignored the diversity of lived Islam, erasing its multiple theological, legal, and cultural expressions. Muslims were othered, portrayed as irrational, violent, and inferior, in need of European governance and Christian correction. Muslim women in particular were depicted as oppressed victims, reinforcing the narrative of a Muslim society as backward and justifying colonial intervention as a civilizing mission. So Orientalist discourse institutionalized these stereotypes, reducing Islam to a threat to be overcome rather than a faith to be understood. Christian missionaries working within this framework largely accepted these distorted constructions. They assumed all Muslims were same and that a universal missionary response would be enough. That means if you make a response to Islam in 1917, that is relevant even today in 2023. There is no change that happened to actually Muslims, so that response is actually fine. So they assumed, so missionaries rarely questioned these colonial caricatures, and instead they became participants in the civilizing mission, engaging in polemics, attempting to rescue Muslim women, and promoting Western Christian norms. In this context, the practice of listening to Muslims was conspicuously absent. The colonial mission model left little room for humility, respect, or a genuine dialogue. It fostered deep mistrust, resistance among Muslim communities, reinforcing barriers rather than building bridges. In today's pluralistic and post-colonial world, this model, rooted in domination, cultural arrogance, and a disregard for Muslim voices, is no longer tenable. Authentic Christian witness requires different posture, one marked by humility, mutual respect, and deep listening. So these are the biblical foundations for deep listening. The practice of deep listening is rooted in the theological witness of the Bible, where listening is presented both as a divine attribute and a human responsibility. So this is illustrated through four key biblical examples. One is the story of Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis reveals God as one who listens. So the meaning of the word Ishmael itself is the God hears. That's actually the meaning of the word Ishmael. When Hagar and her son were abandoned in the wilderness, God listened to their cries and provided for them. This narrative highlights God's attentiveness to the marginalized and calls Christians to imitate God's listening posture. The second one is actually the example of Daniel in exile, illustrated the importance of listening and learning in a foreign context. So Daniel listened attentively and studied the knowledge and wisdom of Babylon, and then he became 10 times better than the local scholars. That's what Daniel 1:20 says. This engagement with the local culture enabled him to serve faithfully without compromising his faith. Third one is Moses. His education in Egyptian wisdom prepared him for his leadership role. He listened, he learned, and engaged with the Egyptian culture, which shaped his ability to lead his people effectively. And the last one is Paul, in the speech at Areopagus, demonstrated deep listening to the cultural and religious context of Athenians. He acknowledged their religiosity, quoted their poets, and engaged their philosophical questions. Paul's witness was informed by careful observation and listening. So these biblical examples provide a theological foundation for listening as an essential practice in mission, particularly in witnessing to Muslims. They reiterated the importance of listening and learning Islam as Muslims themselves understand and live their faith. Such an approach enables Christians to share the gospel in a language and idiom that is meaningful and accessible to Muslim communities. So now a very brief introduction to how Muslims themselves actually decolonize their understanding of actually Islam. That means I told you that most of our understanding of Islam is actually something that is constructed during the colonial period. Now Muslims are actually trying to decolonize that one. And so these are some of the examples. So from a Muslim perspective, Islam is understood to consist of three interrelated dimensions. So the first one is known as Islam. So these things that Muslims do, Iman, what Muslims believe, and Ihsan, what motivates Muslims. So this is the pursuit of spiritual excellence and moral integrity. So these dimensions have historically given rise to three major institutions in Islam, known as Sharia. Sharia is the Islamic law. Then Aqidah, theology and metaphysics, and then Tasawwuf or Sufism, known as spirituality. So these dimensions do not operate in isolation, but are embedded within a long, dynamic tradition of communal interpretation and practice. So Muslim approach Islam as a discursive tradition. So that is a living tradition shaped by centuries of scholarly interpretation, debate, and communal practice. So Muslims believe that there is no break actually in their tradition. There is no need of a reform, or there is no need of actually a kind of a reformation like in Christianity. They did not read the Quran and Hadith in isolation or rely solely on a personal interpretation. Rather, they receive their faith through the interpretative lens of their community, shaped by 1400 years of discursive engagement across diverse cultural and historical contexts. To understand how Muslims believe, practice, and seek meaning, one must attend to this rich interpretative history and the communal dimensions of Islamic life. reducing Islam to a set of theological propositions extracted from the Quran alone overlooks how Muslim identity is formed and lived within a particular cultural, social, and moral frameworks. The second aspect is Muslims not only approach Islam discursively. In Islam, there is no strict divide between sacred and secular. So its teaching encompasses all aspects of life: personal, social, political, and spiritual. Faith is not limited to private belief or ritual practice. It informs ethics, family life, economic behavior, social relations, public responsibilities. Islam is therefore best approached not as a system of doctrines but as a comprehensive way of life, a dynamic tradition embodied in everyday practice and moral aspirations of Muslim communities. So this holistic understanding of Islam requires a discursive and relational approach to Christian witness, one grounded in deep listening to how Muslims understand, interpret, and live out their faith in their specific context. So without such listening, attempts to contextualize the gospel risk being shaped by Christian assumptions rather than by the lived realities of Muslim communities. I think what I'm trying to emphasize here is that one Muslim community understand actually Islam in a particular way, and if you work with that Muslim community, we should not assume that we are equipped to understand another Muslim community. They have a completely different tradition than actually this Muslim community that we are already familiar with. So then think about actually us who actually read only a book about Islam from the library and think that we know everything about actually Islam. so that's why, as W.C. Smith rightly observed, that no two Muslims are same. So serious engagement with Islam demands moving beyond generalized categories and recognizing the diversity of Muslim traditions by listening to how Muslims themselves inhabit and interpret their faith. So deep listening is not obstructed. Deep listening is often obstructed by the pervasive influence of Islamophobia, which is not merely a social prejudice but structurally embedded in the colonial history and missionary imagination of the West. So the very notion of Christian mission to civilize Muslims was shaped by the distorted construction of Islam as violent, irrational, and inferior, an image that justified colonial domination and shaped Western identity in opposition to a devalued Muslim other. As long as Christians continue to assume a posture of superiority, treating Muslims as objects to be fixed or targets to be transformed, genuine listening will remain impossible. Challenging Islamophobia, therefore, requires more than just rejecting media stereotypes. It demands confronting the colonial foundations of Christian self-understanding and missionary framework rooted in domination. Only by dismantling these inherited assumptions can Christians cultivate relationship marked by humility, respect, and deep listening, bearing witness not through the cultural arrogance but through presence and compassion, shared humanity. Yeah, so listening as an ecclesiological practice, Amos Young's ortho triad. So Christian attitude towards non-Christian tradition are often characterized as exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. So I don't know to actually explain what is exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, but I only want to say that so all these approaches have one common the denominator. So that denominator is this one. None of these approaches require engaging non-Muslim traditions from the perspective of their practitioners. That means you can decide whether a Muslim or a Hindu is going to be saved or not. So in contrast, Amos Young's ortho triad of orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy offers a more relational framework for a Christian-Muslim engagement. I just want to briefly explain what is all these three terms means. So orthodoxy means listening for an intellectual engagement. So that means all the doctrines, or that means whatever actually we do in order to communicate something. That's the meaning of actually the word orthodoxy. So, but there are two aspects. One is actually when we communicate something. Remember that we also have the humility to listen. That means it's not enough actually to communicate gospel. We also need to be challenged by their idea of or how they actually receive the gospel. That means there is an aspect of hospitality actually in orthodoxy. So that's why Max Muller mentioned that he who knows one knows none. That means it's always actually through this engagement that we know actually know more about even ourselves. That means my own understanding of actually Christianity is very much actually informed by study of Islam. So I think that's actually the meaning here. That's the meaning of mutual take and give and take. Second one is orthopraxy. Orthopraxy is actually listening for a collaborative engagement. So orthopraxy focuses on the right practice, live out the gospel in ways that promote justice, peace, and a human flourishing. Christians and Muslims together constitute a significant portion of the world's population. Collaboration on issues such as poverty, climate change, human trafficking is essential for global peace and justice. Deep listening is a foundation for such a collaboration. It requires Christians to hear Muslim concerns, respect their ethical framework, and work together for a common good. Listening fosters trust, break out barriers, and open possibilities for shared action. The last one is orthopathy, the need to overcome distractions. Orthopathy is actually the right motivations. So orthopathy emphasizes the relational and emotional dimensions of Christian witness, inviting believers to engage Muslims at the level of the heart. It focuses on cultivating empathy, compassion, and authentic human connection. In Christian-Muslim engagement, orthopathy requires listening not only to what Muslims believe, but also how they feel, what are their fears, their hopes and struggles. At a deeper level, all humans share similar aspirations and anxieties. By exchanging cultural and spiritual resources, we can navigate these shared experiences together. This relational approach demands vulnerability and attentiveness, challenging Christians to set aside assumptions, defensiveness, or the impulse to correct. Deep listening in this sense become an act of hospitality, welcoming the other into one's emotional and spiritual space with the empathy and love. The last point is actually about the insider movement among Muslims, this is considered as one of the fruit of listening. So one of the most significant outcome of deep listening in a Christian-Muslim engagement has been the emergence of insider movements. Communities of Muslim background believers who follow Jesus while remaining within their cultural and religious context. Earlier mission strategies often required Muslims to abandon their identity upon conversion, but attentive listening led missionaries to recognize that faith in Christ does not demand cultural dislocation. Insider movements affirm that gospel can take root in diverse cultural contexts. Missionaries who practice deep listening encourage Muslim background believers to remain embedded in their communities, interpreting the gospel in ways that resonate with their cultural and religious world. Today, hundreds and thousands of Muslim background believers serve as the vital bridge between Christians and Muslims, embodying a witness rooted in respect, continuity, and deep listening. And now to the conclusion. So Christianity is no longer a Western religion. I think that's what we heard actually from the previous presentation. Its center of gravity has shifted to global South. But that is exactly the place where Muslims also are actually living. That's exactly the place where Islam is also deeply rooted. So in this context, colonial mission strategies rooted in domination are obsolete. The church must abandon attitude of superiority and adopt a posture of listening. Deep listening fosters mutual understanding, dismantles stereotypes, and enables Christians to share the gospel in ways that resonate with Muslim worldviews. It opens space to hear the hopes, struggles, and aspirations of Muslim neighbors, and to bear witness marked by love and humility. In an age of interfaith tensions and misunderstanding, the church's willingness to listen deeply will shape authentically and effectively of its witness among Muslims. Thank you. Yes?
I actually was at Barnes & Noble School of Arabic, and I had 3 Muslims behind me. They heard that I spoke Arabic. They asked what I did. I said I was a professor. I didn't say Christian. They invited me over to their home. I had Arabic tea. I had makbous. I took off my shoes with my right hand only. I'm going to do that. But the Holy Spirit just led me, don't say anything about your faith. And the Lord told me, I want you to listen. And I listened for 5 hours.
Okay.
As I sat there in their apartment. And then at the end of 5 hours of listening and letting the Lord lead, they said, well, what do you believe? And I had the chance to share Esau with 3 Muslims. And that day I made 3 friends with 3 Muslims, and a 4th one I met later, and we made a plan to go to Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
And I teach that principle of listening to my students.
Yeah. Yeah.
But language opened the door.
That's right, yeah.
Just learning a couple phrases.
Yeah.
I call it language evangelism. Learning a couple phrases in every language.
Yeah.
Opens the door to evangelism.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between Islam and Christianity. That means we share a lot of stories in common, so many ideas in common, but very little we know these things. So even in India, I always hear that Muslim evangelism is extremely difficult, and they say that Hindu evangelism is much more easier, but there is very little connection between Hinduism and Islam. That means there are no common stories. There is no way in which you can actually convince a Hindu about the Muslim, the stories in the Bible. But the stories in the Quran and the Bible are almost the same. But somehow we got this idea that Muslim evangelism is extremely difficult because maybe because we don't want to actually sit for 5 hours and listen to service.
Brother Jules, I had a question, and it dovetails off of my brother's comment. And I was thinking about deep listening in a place like here at Barnes & Noble, or with people that you meet at Barnes & Noble in the United States, deep listening in a multi-religious context like India, compared to deep listening in a predominantly Muslim country like Pakistan. And I was wondering if you could say anything about the way one would enter, or the posture one would assume, how it would be different in Pakistan, say in India, or the United States. If you wanted to listen deeply like my brother, what would you say about each of those 3 different contexts?
Yeah. So I think that's why I brought 2 ways in which Muslims try to actually decolonizing their own understanding of religion. One is actually they try to see Islam actually as a living tradition of 1400 years. That means they say that it actually began with the Quran, and then they talk about actually Quranic interpretation. So every Muslim would say that all the practices are actually rooted in the Quran or in the Hadith. And, but if you ask actually very closely, you will understand that it is not as we actually say about how our faith is actually rooted in the Quran, in the Bible. That's not the way actually they talk about actually how their faith actually rooted in the Quran. So actually their faith is rooted in the tradition of the interpretation than actually directly in the Quran. That's one part. The other part is actually all the aspects of the Muslim culture is also shaped by actually Islam, or maybe actually some Islamic tradition. That means whether it is about the practice of making tea, or whether it is about using actually the right hand, not actually the left hand. So you may not actually find Quranic verses for any of these things, but this is what actually Muslims deeply believe. That means that their architecture, the way in which they read, they write. So I think deep listening also means understanding actually a totally different culture, not simply actually a set of beliefs. I think that is the most important part. And so I would say that if you move outside of US, so that means in the US, many of the Muslims themselves are actually not very sure about what is the meaning of Islamic culture, because second generation Muslims and many of the second generation Christians are almost same. So they have very little idea about what is actually the meaning of their own cultural tradition. So they are just like Americans, like any other people. But I think outside of US, I think what we really need to understand is actually not so much actually Quran and Hadith. That is not what is useful actually in interacting with Muslims. What is really useful in interacting with Muslims is actually the local culture. That means whether you are able to eat their food, or drink the tea as they drinking tea, whether they can, yeah, whether you are able to actually do many things that they are actually doing it. But I found that in the US context, culture is not that much actually important for many of these Muslims. So that is where actually the doctrines and those things are actually becoming important. So there, if you know a little bit about actually many of these shared stories, shared traditions, I think those will certainly actually help us to make a conversation and continue that conversation with the Muslims. Thank you.
I don't know, you had Islamophobia up there, and I just keep thinking of how many people don't have the humility to get over the fear of being changed.
Yeah.
If I talk religion with you, I might get a new idea and I might be changed. If I participate in culture, I might be changed. And how do we explain to our brothers and sisters that might be a really good thing if we got changed?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. I think so. What I presented actually in my paper, and also something that I writing in my book is Islamophobia has actually a very deep tradition. That means it's not something that happened with the 9/11 or maybe something that happened in the 90s. It is having actually started with the Crusades. So that means just a long tradition, and it continued. So do you know that it's the same way actually Jews also were actually hated until 1947. That means both Jews and Muslims were hated. And suddenly in 1947 with the establishment of Israel, we have something known as Judeo-Christian tradition. Until that time there was no Judeo-Christian tradition. So with Judeo-Christian tradition, the Jews were actually moved out of this hatredness of the Semitic race. So until that time, so they were also were hated exactly the same way like Muslims were hated. So Muslims are still actually part of that phobia. So the Jews were not actually part of that phobia. So that's why I'm saying that unless we understand this history, that means where it began. So we may think that it is something that actually happened yesterday because of this towers. No, it is. No, it has a very deep roots, and unless we understand this history and unless we actually dismantle this history, it is not actually possible for us to think about Islamophobia or having actually a different attitude. That's why I said that media is not the only one responsible for Islamophobia. We may think that if you challenge media, that will be in the end. No. So our own understanding of Christianity, mission, everything is actually deep rooted actually in this idea of Islamophobia. We didn't like that race altogether. It's not actually about one Muslim. Whether Muslims are actually South Asians or whether born here or whether born in another country, they all are same. That's actually the meaning of Islamophobia. So it's much more than actually racism or any kind of hatred that we actually developed actually in human beings.
thank you.